The door to the extra room stood open, and Gertrude Rhodes stared into it like it was a confession she hadn't been ready to hear. She had come to Dusthaven, Colorado in the autumn of 1882 with one battered trunk, a letter of employment, and a secret so heavy it had begun to reshape the way she carried herself, shoulders slightly forward, chin tucked, as though she were perpetually bracing for impact. She had not come expecting kindness. She had not come expecting Charles Graves. But there she stood, in the narrow hallway of his ranch house, staring at a room that was fully furnished. A narrow iron bed with a proper quilted coverlet, a writing desk with a small oil lamp, a window with simple muslin curtains, a wooden chair with a cushion sewn from flour sack linen. Every object in the room spoke of deliberate care, of someone who had thought about comfort rather than utility alone. And Charles was behind her in the hallway, holding a lantern that threw warm gold light across the pine plank floor, and he said it quietly, almost to himself, the way a person says something they have rehearsed many times but still doesn't quite know how to deliver. "I built this extra room before I knew who needed it," he said. Gertrude turned to look at him, and in the flickering amber light she saw something on his face that she had not expected to find on the face of a man like Charles Graves, a man who was known in 4 counties for being self-contained, for running his cattle operation alone, for declining every supper invitation from every matchmaking widow in the territory. What she saw on his face was vulnerability, raw and unguarded. He hadn't meant to say it the way it came out. He hadn't meant to say it at all, maybe, and she understood everything. She understood that he had built the room not for a hired hand, not for a passing traveler, not for any practical ranch purpose. He had built it for someone. He had built it out of hope and loneliness and a stubborn, private faith that the right person would eventually come along and need exactly what he had quietly prepared. He had built it the way a man builds things when he doesn't know how to say what he's feeling out loud, with his hands, with wood and nails, with a window facing east so the morning light would fall in at a generous angle. Gertrude's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the dry Colorado air and everything to do with the fact that she was carrying a secret that made her unworthy of this room, of this house, of this man's quiet, unconscious hope. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. She stepped inside. She did not yet tell him what she was hiding, but she understood what he had said, and the understanding lit something small and frightened inside her chest, like a match struck in a very dark room, too small to illuminate everything, but enough to see by for just a moment. This is where the story truly begins. 3 weeks earlier, Gertrude Rhodes had stepped off the eastbound stage from Pueblo in the town of Dusthaven, Colorado, and she had done it the way a person does something they are not entirely sure about quickly, before they could change their mind. Dusthaven in 1882 was not a large town. It had a main street with a general store, a telegraph office, a livery stable, a modest hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a church whose steeple leaned slightly southwest from a windstorm the previous spring, and 3 saloons, which said something about the town's priorities. It sat in a wide valley at the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountain foothills, and the land around it was the kind of beautiful that didn't announce itself, open grassland running up into pine-covered slopes, the sky enormous and impartial overhead. Gertrude had found the employment notice in the Denver newspaper. A rancher named Charles Graves was seeking a qualified teacher to instruct the children of the surrounding homesteads, as Dusthaven had been attempting for 2 years to establish a schoolhouse and failing to keep any instructor long enough to accomplish it. The position offered room and board in addition to a modest wage. The notice had been carefully worded. She thought not desperate, but serious. It had said something that other notices she had seen did not say. The position requires someone of genuine dedication and patience. It does not require someone perfect. That last sentence had caught in her chest and stayed there. It does not require someone perfect. She had read it 3 times. Then she had written a letter of application. She was 26 years old. She had been trained as a teacher at a normal school in Ohio, and she had taught for 2 years in Cincinnati before her life had collapsed in a way she could not have anticipated and did not know how to explain to anyone who asked. She had left Ohio with a story that was technically true but strategically incomplete. She had come west because the West was where people came when they needed to become someone new, or at least when they needed distance from who they had been. Dusthaven's town sheriff, a compact, weathered man named Harold Pettit who had met the stage because the rancher had asked him to, loaded her trunk onto a buckboard without ceremony and told her that Mr. Graves would be along directly. He said it in the tone of a man reporting a weather fact, not extending a social courtesy. Charles Graves arrived 12 minutes later on a bay horse that moved with the economy of a well-trained animal. He was 31 years old, and he was not what she had constructed in her imagination during the 2-day stage ride from Pueblo. She had imagined someone older, someone rougher, someone with the particular bluster she had come to associate with men who placed notices in newspapers demanding teachers for their communities. She had imagined someone who would look at her and see a position that needed filling, the way you look at an empty chair. Charles Graves looked at her and seemed to actually see her. It was disconcerting. He was tall with broad shoulders and the lean, functional build of a man who worked outdoors in every season. His face was honest, not particularly handsome in the conventional sense, but the kind of face that rewards continued looking, with a strong jaw, brown eyes that were direct without being aggressive, and a mouth that suggested it was more comfortable being quiet than talking. He wore a practical hat, practical boots, practical clothes. There was nothing showy about him. He shook her hand with a firm grip and introduced himself with his name and nothing else, and then he said, "I appreciate you making the journey, Miss Rhodes. I expect the stage from Pueblo is not particularly comfortable." "It is not," she agreed, "but I have ridden on worse." Something flickered in his expression, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement that she had answered honestly rather than graciously, which perhaps interested him. He helped her trunk into the buckboard without asking if she needed help, which she found she preferred to the alternative of being asked and having to decline. On the drive to the ranch, which took the better part of an hour along a dirt road that wound through grassland and past 2 other homesteads, they talked about the schoolhouse situation. Charles explained it without editorializing, which she respected. The town had a building, a single-room structure that had previously been used for grain storage before a larger facility was built. It needed work but was structurally sound. There were approximately 22 children in the surrounding area who were of school age, between 6 and 14, most of them from farming and ranching families. The previous 2 teachers had lasted 4 months and 6 months respectively. The first had left because of the isolation. The second had left because she had married a mine owner from Gunnison, which Charles delivered without judgment, as though it were simply a data point. "Why did you build the room?" Gertrude asked, and then immediately regretted asking it because she hadn't meant to ask it at all. It had simply come out, prompted by something she couldn't name, the directness of him, maybe, or her own exhausted inability to maintain small talk when there were more interesting questions available. Charles was quiet for a moment. He looked at the road ahead of them, at the 2 horses pulling the buckboard at the middle distance. Then he said, "The boarding house in town is not a suitable long-term arrangement for a woman on her own. It's noisy and the meals are inconsistent. I have the space." It seemed sensible. It was a practical answer. It was probably a true answer. But it was not, she sensed, the complete answer. She did not press him on it. The ranch was called the Graves Creek Ranch, named for the small creek that ran along its northern boundary. Charles informed her when she asked that the creek had been named by his father, who had homesteaded the land in 1869, and that there was a small irony in the name since it was very much a living place. He said this without quite smiling, but she caught the dryness of it and appreciated it more than she showed. The house was solid and well-made, larger than she expected. It was built from local timber and stone, 2 stories, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. Inside it was clean and spare without being barren. There were books on a shelf in the main room. She counted them automatically. A Teacher's Habit, 23 volumes. A mix of practical reference books, some history, a novel or two. The kitchen was well equipped. The floors were swept. There were curtains on the windows that someone had made with care, and she wondered briefly who had made them since he lived alone. He showed her the room last. It was down a short hallway off the kitchen, and when he opened the door and held the lantern up, she had arrived in the late afternoon and the light was already going. She stood in the doorway and saw what he had built, and then he said the words, the ones that would stay with her, the ones that would eventually rearrange everything inside her. I built this extra room before I knew who needed it, and she understood everything. She settled into the routine of the ranch with surprising ease, which told her something about herself she had not previously known, that she was capable of belonging to a place quickly, when the place was right. She rose early, as Charles did, and the mornings became their time, a quiet shared domesticity that was careful and unspoken and mutually maintained. He made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she discovered she liked it that way. She helped with breakfast though he didn't ask her to, and he helped clear the table though she didn't expect it, and the small, ordinary mechanics of sharing a living space built a kind of trust between them that had nothing to do with conversation. The schoolhouse needed considerable preparation before she could begin teaching. Charles gave her 3 of his ranch hands, a pair of brothers named Eli and Tom Driscoll, and a quiet Cheyenne man named Joseph Whitehorse, who had worked for the Graves family since Charles's father's time and who Gertrude quickly recognized as the most skilled carpenter of the 3, to help her repair the building and build the necessary furniture. Desks, a proper teaching board, shelves for the books and materials she had brought with her, a stove for the coming winter, which in Colorado at nearly 6,000 feet of elevation arrived with authority. She worked alongside them, which surprised the Driscoll brothers and did not seem to surprise Joseph Whitehorse at all. She carried boards and held them while they were nailed, mixed whitewash, and applied it to the walls, and sorted through the donated books and materials that had accumulated in a box in the general store waiting for a teacher who would actually stay. Word spread through the homesteads and ranches that the new teacher was serious. Families began to bring their children to meet her, arriving on Saturdays at the schoolhouse with varying degrees of formality. She learned the community this way, name by name, face by face. The Abbotts, who ran a sheep operation to the south. The Mendoza family, who had a kitchen garden that was the most productive in the valley. The Stricklands, who had 5 children between the ages of 7 and 13, and who were the loudest and most energetic people she had met in the territory. Old Margaret Finch, who ran the general store and was technically not a parent but who attended the Saturday meetings anyway because she was the town's unofficial clearinghouse for all social information and had opinions she needed to share. What she noticed was that everyone she met asked about Charles Graves in the sideways manner of people who are interested in a topic but not willing to admit it directly. How was he? Was he well? Had he seemed? And here the questioners would pause and find some euphemism, less solitary lately. Was he eating properly? She answered each inquiry honestly and slightly less informatively than the questioner desired, which seemed to be the right approach. Margaret Finch, being Margaret Finch, was direct about it. "That man has been alone too long," she told Gertrude, standing behind the counter of the general store with her arms folded and her expression suggesting this was a civic concern rather than gossip. "He's a good man, the best kind. The kind that doesn't know how good he is, which is rarer than you'd think. His father built that ranch with nothing but determination and a strong back, and Charles has doubled it through sheer competence and stubbornness. He deserves someone." Gertrude had been examining a bolt of blue wool fabric at the time, and she kept her eyes on it. "I'm the school teacher, Mrs. Finch," she said mildly. "I know what you are," Margaret said. "I'm telling you what I see." What Gertrude was not telling anyone, what she had not told anyone since she left Ohio, was this: she had been engaged. His name was Reverend Arthur Callum, and he had been 38 years old to her 24 when they met, and he had been charming and educated, and had spoken beautifully about justice and the moral obligations of the educated to uplift the less fortunate, and she had believed every word of it for 14 months. Right up until the afternoon she had discovered, through a confluence of overheard conversation and a letter she had not been meant to see, that Arthur Callum already had a wife, a first wife, a woman named Eleanor who lived in a town 40 miles east and who had been married to him for 9 years and who knew nothing about Gertrude. She had broken the engagement immediately. She had done it in the direct, quiet manner that was her nature, going to him privately and saying what she knew and ending it before he could construct an explanation. He had tried anyway. He had called it a technicality of law that did not reflect the true state of his heart. He had said that Eleanor was mentally unwell and they had been separated for years, and that the legal formalities had simply not been completed. He had said, most unforgivably, that Gertrude had known what she was getting into. She had not known. She had been deceived. The distinction mattered enormously to her, and the fact that he could not understand why it mattered was its own answer. She left Cincinnati 3 months after the broken engagement. She had tried to stay, tried to return to her classroom and her life, but the story had spread, as stories do in a city where people know each other through church and social obligation. And the particular cruelty of small city gossip is that it rarely distinguishes between victim and participant. She had found herself being looked at with a mixture of pity and suspicion that she found intolerable. Some people pitied her. Some people wondered what she had known and when. Some people, and these were the ones who drove her out, seemed to believe that any woman who had been engaged to a married man bore some portion of the blame for whatever had happened, regardless of whether she had known or not. The truth was that she had been deceived, used, and then blamed for the deception. And the shame of it, not shame for what she had done, because she had done nothing wrong, but shame at having been fooled, at having trusted someone so completely and been so comprehensively wrong. That shame had settled into her bones like cold weather and had not left. She had not told Charles Graves any of this. She had not told anyone in Dusthaven. She had told them the technical truth. She had been a teacher in Cincinnati and had decided to seek a position in the West. The rest was silence. But secrets are not inert things. They do not simply sit quietly inside a person while the person gets on with living. They affect posture and timing, and the precise angle at which a person deflects certain questions. They create hesitation at moments when a person with nothing to hide would simply answer. And Charles Graves, who was quiet and observant and who said very little but missed very little, had noticed her hesitations. She knew he had. She could see it in the way he sometimes looked at her across the kitchen table in the mornings, not with suspicion, but with the patient attention of someone who has decided to wait rather than ask. The school opened on a Monday in late October 1882, with 19 children present out of an anticipated 22, the 3 absent being the youngest of the Mendoza children, who were unwell, and whose recovery she personally inquired after the following Wednesday. She rang the bell, a proper school bell that Charles had located somewhere and installed in the small wooden tower she and Joseph Whitehorse had built above the door at 8 in the morning, and the children came in out of the autumn cold and filled the desk she had built with the Driscoll brothers, and she stood at the front of the room and felt, for the first time in over a year, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Teaching was the thing she knew how to do cleanly, without ambiguity or hidden calculation. A child either understood a thing or didn't, and if they didn't, it was her job to find a different way to explain it. The work was honest. She was good at it, genuinely good, not just technically competent, but gifted in the way that some teachers are gifted, with the ability to see each child as an individual problem to be understood, rather than a uniform set of tasks to be completed. The children of Dusthaven were a range of personalities that delighted and challenged her in approximately equal measure. William Strickland, who was 11, was brilliant and bored, and needed constant intellectual challenge, or he caused creative disruption. Lucia Mendoza, who was 9, was quietly and stubbornly determined to learn everything, arriving 15 minutes before the others and staying 15 minutes after, asking careful questions that often made Gertrude think harder than she expected to. A boy named Tobias Pine, who was 13 and the son of a homesteader who Gertrude had gathered, was not particularly kind to his family, came to school with the hunched-shoulder posture of someone accustomed to being wrong before he opened his mouth, and she made a private project of finding things he was right about and saying so in front of the others. Charles drove her to the schoolhouse each morning and collected her each afternoon. This had been established as a practical arrangement. The schoolhouse was 3 miles from the ranch, too far to walk comfortably in winter, and with good reason to not have her traveling alone given the occasional character that passed through the territory. It had been presented by Charles as a logistic solution, and she had accepted it as such. But the drives, in the buckboard or sometimes on horseback when the weather was good, became something she looked forward to with a specificity that she recognized and tried not to examine too carefully. He asked about the children, not in a perfunctory way but with genuine curiosity. He remembered what she told him from one day to the next, so that he would ask follow-up questions. How was the Mendoza girl doing with her fractions? Had William Strickland found the book on natural philosophy she had mentioned she was going to lend him? He listened to her with the kind of attention that is rarer than it should be, and she found herself telling him more than she planned to each time, because he created in her the particular comfort of knowing she would not have to repeat herself. In return, she learned him, the way you learn someone gradually through the daily currency of small information. He was methodical and thorough in his work, to the point of something that might generously be called perfectionism, and less generously called stubbornness. He was exceptionally patient with animals and with people, with the particular exception of dishonesty, which she gathered from 2 separate incidents. One involving a cattle buyer from Pueblo who had misrepresented what he was offering, and one involving the eldest Driscoll brother making a claim about a fence repair he hadn't actually done, produced in Charles a cold, contained anger that was more impressive and more alarming than shouting would have been. He was capable of great kindness, executed with the minimum of fuss. She observed this in the way he handled the homesteader families he dealt with. Many of them were struggling in the way that settlers in Colorado in 1882 often struggled. Weather and market prices, and the unforgiving arithmetic of frontier life creating a kind of chronic precarity. Charles extended credit quietly, helped with labor without making it a social event, arranged things so that people could accept help without having to acknowledge that they needed it. He had never been married. She knew this from Margaret Finch's comprehensive social briefing, and from the particular quality of silence in the house, which was not the silence of a space that had been cleared of someone's presence, but the silence of a space that had always been waiting. By November, she had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and something had quietly shifted between them in a way that neither of them had named, and neither of them rushed to examine. It was a warmth, a comfort, a specific quality of looking forward to mornings that had nothing to do with the coffee. She caught herself noticing things about him. The way he handled the horses with such matter-of-fact gentleness, the way he read in the evenings with his boots off and his long legs stretched toward the fire, the way he laughed at things she said, not the polite laugh of social obligation but a real laugh that came from somewhere unexpected and seemed to surprise him slightly each time. She also caught herself keeping her secret with increasing effort. It was not that she feared he would hate her if he knew. She was reasonably confident he would not. It was that she feared he would pity her, and pity from Charles Graves, pity specifically from him, felt like something she could not tolerate. She had been pitied enough. She had been defined by the worst thing that had happened to her long enough. She had come west to be someone whose defining feature was what she could do rather than what had been done to her. The secret became acute on a Tuesday in late November, in a way she had not anticipated. She was at the general store collecting supplies after school. Charles was late that afternoon, held up by a fence situation on the north pasture, when a man came through the door behind her that she recognized. Her body recognized him before her mind did, a full-body flinching response that she suppressed immediately and thoroughly, turning it into the calmly interested expression she had spent years perfecting. His name was David Callum. He was Arthur Callum's younger brother. He was in Dusthaven because, she discovered in the following 10 terrible minutes, Arthur had sent him. Arthur had somehow traced her to Colorado. She had underestimated how determined a man could be when he wanted to be, and she had also underestimated how many people in Cincinnati had been willing to provide her forwarding address. And David was here with a letter and a mission. David Callum was not, himself, a bad man. He was weak in the way of men who do what their family asks without examining why. He handed her the letter with the apologetic expression of a man who knows he is doing something wrong, but has committed to doing it anyway. The letter from Arthur was 4 pages of dense handwriting that accomplished several things at once. It restated his position that the situation with Alina was not what it appeared to be. It expressed his grief over Gertrude's departure. It described, in careful and legal language, how Arthur's brother would be in the area for several weeks on other business, and that Arthur hoped she would take the opportunity to speak with David and perhaps reconsider. And in the final paragraph, with a chill that she had to read twice to fully absorb, it suggested that her position in Dusthaven might be complicated if it became known to the community there that she had been engaged to a married man. It was not quite a threat. It was shaped to avoid being quite a threat, but it was absolutely a threat. She read the letter twice, folded it with precise movements, put it in her coat pocket, thanked David Callum with a pleasantness that she could feel was not reaching her eyes, and turned back to her shopping as though he were not standing in the doorway watching her. He left after a moment. Margaret Finch, behind the counter, was doing a heroic imitation of someone who had been focused entirely on inventory, but Gertrude could see by the set of her jaw that she had heard and observed more than she was letting on. "Trouble?" Margaret asked quietly. "Nothing I can't manage," Gertrude said, which was the answer she wanted to be true. Charles arrived at the store 20 minutes later, apologized briefly for being late, loaded her supplies into the buckboard, and they set off toward the ranch. He glanced at her once during the first mile of the drive and did not say anything. She was grateful for it. She was also aware that his silence was not obliviousness. He had noticed something was wrong and had chosen to give her space rather than press her, which was exactly what she needed, and also what made it harder not to simply tell him everything. She told him nothing that evening. She sat with the folded letter in her coat pocket through supper, and through the quiet hour afterward when he read, and she graded the children's arithmetic exercises, and she felt the letter against her ribs like a coal that was still warm. That night, alone in the room he had built, she lay awake for a long time, the room he had built before he knew who needed it. She pressed her palm flat against the wooden wall and thought about what it meant that this room existed, that he had made it, that he had said those words with the rawness of something true, and she thought about Arthur Callum's letter and his small, ugly threat, and she thought about what she had run from and what she had, without intending to, arrived at. She decided 2 things before she slept. The first was that she would not be threatened into returning to Cincinnati or into silence. The second was that Charles Graves deserved to know the truth about her, not because the letter might reach him first, though that was part of it, but because he had built that room in good faith, and she was living in it under a version of herself that was incomplete, and the gap between who she was letting him see and who she actually was had begun to feel like its own kind of betrayal. She told him the next morning. She waited until they were on the drive to the schoolhouse, which she chose deliberately outdoors in motion, with the distance of the open Colorado landscape around them and the practical necessity of arriving at school, providing a natural end point that prevented the conversation from becoming either prolonged or claustrophobic. She told him everything. The engagement, the discovery, the ugly aftermath, the letter she had received yesterday. She told it in the precise, unembellished way she might explain something to a student, the facts in order, without dramatic color, because the facts were dramatic enough without assistance. She kept her eyes on the road ahead and her hands folded in her lap, and she talked until she was finished, and then she stopped and let the silence run. Charles drove for perhaps a quarter of a mile without speaking. She counted the hoofbeats of the horses. She did not look at him. "You did nothing wrong," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement offered as a kind of foundation on which everything else would stand. "I know that," she said. "The difficulty is that not everyone agrees." "Not everyone's agreement is required," he said. She looked at him then. He was watching the road with the same focused calm he brought to most things, but there was something in his jaw that was different from his usual expression. A tightness. Not at her. At Arthur Callum, she realized. He was quietly and specifically furious on her behalf, in the contained, cold way she had seen before and recognized now. "The letter," he said after another moment. "This man, Arthur's brother, is he still in town?" He indicated he was staying at the hotel for several weeks. Charles nodded slowly. There was a quality to his silence that suggested he was working through something. "David Callum has no power over your position here," he said. "Your position is determined by the school board, which consists of myself and 3 other ranchers, none of whom are going to concern themselves with the private circumstances of your life in Ohio. You are an excellent teacher. The children are thriving. That is the entirety of what matters to the school board." She felt something loosen in her chest. Not entirely, but enough. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "You told me when you were ready," he said. "That's your right." They reached the schoolhouse. He helped her down from the buckboard as he always did, a hand briefly under her elbow, and she was always careful not to hold on longer than the descent required, because the brief contact was already something she thought about too carefully afterward. But today, on the ground with her hand withdrawing and him still standing close, she looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Charles." She used his first name for the first time, and she felt the significance of it, and so did he. She could see it in the slight stillness that came over his face, a moment of recognition. "Gertrude," he said, and it was just her name, and it was enough. He drove away. She went inside and rang the bell and taught 9 hours worth of children who needed her, and she felt clearer than she had in months. The matter of David Callum resolved itself with less drama than she had feared and slightly more than she would have preferred. Charles rode into Dusthaven 2 days later, and she did not ask what he did there. She gathered from Sheriff Pettit's subsequent report to Margaret Finch, which Margaret faithfully conveyed to Gertrude with characteristic efficiency, that Charles had spoken with David Callum directly. The details of the conversation were not entirely known. What was known was that David Callum left Dusthaven 4 days earlier than he had planned, and that a letter went west to Cincinnati by the next available post, the contents of which Charles did not disclose and which Gertrude did not ask about directly, though she asked, once, "What did you say to him?" Charles considered the question with his characteristic thoroughness. "I told him that Miss Rhodes is under the protection of this community, that any attempt to damage her reputation in this town or any other would be dealt with accordingly, and that his brother should consider the matter of his legal marriage a private problem requiring a legal solution and not a strategy requiring Gertrude Rhodes's participation." "You said all of that." "I was relatively brief," he said. "I imagine you were," she said. He looked at her with that almost smile that was becoming one of her most carefully hoarded observations, and she looked back at him, and the kitchen was very warm from the stove, and neither of them said anything for a moment. After that, things were different between them in a way that was perceptible, but had not yet been named. He began to look at her directly when they talked instead of slightly to one side of her, as though he had previously been careful about something, and had decided to stop being careful. She began to find reasons to linger in conversations that she might previously have ended politely and retreated from. They read in the evenings with a companionableness that had deepened from the comfortable to the intimate, not in any improper sense, but in the sense that the silence between them had changed quality, had become a silence that included rather than separated. December came, and with it the full Colorado winter, which arrived with an opinion. The ranch settled into its cold weather rhythms, cattle moved to the south-facing pastures, the extra wood stacked beside the doors. The days shortened to a stark, beautiful darkness at both ends. Gertrude continued teaching through conditions that she found bracing, and some of the parents found alarming, and she instituted a policy of having the older children help the younger ones with their coats and boots that served double pedagogical purpose. On the 15th of December, a Saturday, there was a snowstorm that made travel impractical, and she and Charles spent the day at the ranch in a kind of enforced domestic intimacy that was both pleasant and nerve-wracking. He brought in extra firewood and she made bread, a skill she had been quietly developing since arriving at the ranch, and the house smelled of yeast and wood smoke, and she had flour on her sleeve when he came in from the cold with an armload of logs and set them by the fire, and then stood up and looked at her and said, simply, "I would like to take you to the Christmas gathering at the Abbott's farm, if you would like to go." The Abbott's Christmas gathering was a large annual affair that served as the social event of the year for the Dusthaven community. Going to it together, she understood, would mean something to everyone who attended. It would mean something visible and public, an announcement of a kind which in Dusthaven in 1882 had weight. She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was thinking about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. Then she said, "Yes, I would like that." Something shifted in his face, a warming, a relief, though she hadn't realized until that moment that he had been uncertain about her answer. It made her feel, unexpectedly, protective of him. He was a man who was very competent and very confident in almost everything except this. Except her. "Good," he said, which was a very Charles Graves response to something he was genuinely moved by. The gathering was on Christmas Eve, which fell on a Sunday that year. She wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had been saving, and she braided her dark hair into an arrangement that was more careful than her daily efficiency required. She saw him notice when she came out of her room, though he said nothing about it. He had dressed with unusual care himself, a clean dark coat, a shirt that had been pressed. He offered her his arm to help her up into the buckboard, and she took it. The Abbott's farm was warm and crowded and smelled of pine and wood smoke and roasting meat. The entire Dusthaven community seemed to be present. She was greeted by children from her school who were delighted to see her outside the school context, which made them slightly louder than usual. She was greeted by Margaret Finch, who assessed the situation between Gertrude and Charles with one comprehensive glance, and smiled the smile of someone who has been right about something important. Charles stayed close to her through the evening in the way of a man who is being deliberate about it, not possessively, not in a way that confined her, but with a proximity that communicated something to everyone who observed it, including her. He brought her cider. He steered her smoothly away from a conversational trap being set by the most aggressively curious of the Strickland parents. He stood beside her when she talked with Joseph Whitehorse and his family, and contributed to the conversation naturally, which she noticed and appreciated, because not everyone treated Joseph with the easy respect Charles did. Toward the end of the evening, when the gathering had thinned, and some families were collecting their children and wrapping them in coats for the cold drive home. He found her standing at the window looking at the snow that was falling softly outside, and he stood beside her in the dark and quiet of the window alcove, and she was aware of him with a completeness that made her feel both very still and very alert. "I have been wanting to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. The directness of her response seemed to settle something in him. He turned from the window to look at her, and in the low light she could see the care with which he was choosing his words, the particular attention he gave to honesty. "I have not been good at expressing things," he said. "I have managed my life on the ranch with considerable efficiency and considerably less of the rest of it. I built the room, and I told you about the room, and I did not explain what I meant when I said it, because I thought perhaps it was too soon to say it plainly." "It was not too soon," she said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was anything but. He looked at her. "I think I knew from the stage that day, from the first conversation," he said. "I knew the way you know something is important before you know why it's important. I have spent the past months trying to be practical and patient and appropriate, and I have appreciated every morning and every evening and every drive and every conversation in a way that I think you probably know about because you see things, Gertrude. You see clearly." "I see you clearly," she said. "Yes. Then you know what I'm trying to say." "I know," she said, "but I would like you to say it anyway." He took a breath, then, "I love you. I have been loving you since the first week, and I have been arguing with myself about timing and propriety, and I find I am out of patience for arguing with myself." The window behind them was cold, and the room behind them was warm, and the snow fell outside with the slow impartiality of nature, and she said, "I love you too, Charles. I have been trying very hard to be sensible about it, and I find that sensible is becoming increasingly unavailable as an option." He didn't say anything else. He reached out and took her hand, the first time he had held her hand deliberately rather than functionally, and his grip was warm and certain, and she held on. They drove home through the snow with their shoulders touching and the world entirely quiet, and at the door of the ranch house he stopped on the porch and said, with his characteristic economy, "I should like to court you properly, if that is acceptable." "It is acceptable," she said. "Good night, Gertrude." "Good night, Charles." She went inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway for a full minute, perfectly still, with her hand pressed over her heart, which was conducting itself in a manner she found entirely undignified and wholly welcome. The courtship that followed was characteristically thorough. Charles approached it the way he approached anything he considered important, with attention, patience, and a total absence of performance. He did not suddenly become someone different. He was simply, incrementally, more openly himself with her, which she found far more valuable than grand gestures. He brought her small things, a book he thought she would like from the trading post in Pueblo when Eli Driscoll went on a supply run. A particular kind of tea she had mentioned once, which he had somehow noted and sourced. A piece of turquoise he had found near the creek, smoothed by water, which he handed to her one morning with no ceremony and no explanation, and which she put in the pocket of her dress and kept there for weeks. She gave him things too. She mended something he hadn't asked her to mend. She noticed that he liked dried apple cake and made it on Sundays. She began asking him questions about the cattle operation, genuine questions, because she was genuinely curious, and he answered them with the patient pleasure of someone who rarely gets to talk about something they love to someone who is actually listening. January brought the worst storm of the season, which left them housebound for 4 days, and the 4 days were the best 4 days she had spent in years. They played cards. They read aloud to each other. She read him a passage from a history of the Roman Empire that she found in his collection, and he read her a cattle breeding manual without any apparent irony, which somehow made it funnier, and she laughed until she nearly dropped her cup of coffee. They had long conversations about things she had not discussed with anyone in a long time, about her childhood in Ohio, about what she believed about education and justice, about whether the West would eventually become entirely domesticated, or whether it would retain some quality of openness that was worth preserving. He told her about his father, a man named James Graves who had come to Colorado with $20 and a plan, and had built the ranch from open land over 20 years, who had died of a fever when Charles was 22, leaving him the ranch and the debt and the 1,000 daily decisions, who had been, from Charles's description, a man of enormous practical wisdom and very little formal education, and who had told his son once, and Charles repeated this with the careful precision of someone quoting something they have held on to, the most important thing you can build is something worth staying in. He meant the ranch, Charles said. He might have meant more than that, Gertrude said. Charles looked at her steadily. Yes, he said, I think he might have. She told him about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before her, who had died when Gertrude was 16, and who she still carried with her in the way she approached teaching, in the particular belief that education was not merely the transfer of information, but the practice of genuine attention paid to another person's mind. She told him about Cincinnati, the whole of it now, not just the Arthur Callum disaster but the years before it, the ones that had been good, the feeling of competence and belonging she had had in her classroom, the way it had been damaged, and then the way she had come to understand that she could build it again somewhere else. You didn't just come west to escape, he said. It was not quite a question. No, she said. I came west because I wanted to find out what I was made of when no one was watching who already had an opinion about me. And he said, she considered. I find I'm made of things I like better than I expected, she said. He smiled at that, the full, unguarded smile that she so rarely saw on him, and that did entirely unreasonable things to her composure. So do I, he said. Find that. About you. By February they had settled into a form of togetherness that was so natural and complete that she sometimes had to remind herself it was recent, that 3 months ago she hadn't known him. She measured the time in what she now knew about him, which felt like a great deal, that he got up at 4:30 without an alarm because he had never needed one, that he could not read in a room with an off-pitch sound without eventually having to fix the sound, that he was privately superstitious about one specific thing, which was that he never counted cattle until the season was fully done, on the grounds that counting was tempting something he didn't want to tempt. That his face when he was working through a problem he was uncertain about was very slightly different from his face when he was certain, an infinitesimal loosening of the jaw, a slightly wider quality to his eyes. That he had never in his life cried in front of another person, as far as she could tell, but that the only time she had seen him come close to it was when he had been talking about his father. He asked her to marry him in March, at the creek that ran along the north boundary of the ranch, Graves Creek, named by his father, the living place with the ironic name. He had asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon, when the weather had turned toward spring with that particular optimism of high-altitude spring, tentative and brilliant. The willows along the creek were just beginning to show green, and the water was running fast with snowmelt, and he stopped at the bank and turned to her and asked her in one straightforward sentence whether she would marry him, with the directness of a man who has thought about something thoroughly and said it exactly as he means it. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She heard herself saying it and felt the absolute correctness of it in the same way she had felt the correctness of the room when she had stepped into it. And when she said yes, he reached out and held her face in both his hands with a gentleness that seemed entirely too large for his practical, capable hands. And she looked up at him and felt something happen in her chest that she had no adequate language for. Something that was joy and also grief for all the time she had spent being afraid, and also a kind of deep, anchoring relief that this was real and she had not invented it. He kissed her. It was a careful, tender, purposeful kiss, Charles in everything. She kissed him back with everything she had. They were married in April in the Dusthaven church, on a Saturday, with the sun coming through the southwest-leaning steeple at an angle that lit everything gold. The schoolchildren formed a somewhat chaotic honor guard that she had not asked for, and which was organized by Lucia Mendoza with an efficiency that Gertrude found both touching and impressive. Margaret Finch cried with undisguised satisfaction. Joseph Whitehorse stood at the back of the church and nodded once when Charles and Gertrude exchanged their vows, with the gravity of a man acknowledging something that was right. The wedding itself was modest and entirely wonderful. The minister, a young man named Reverend Thompson who had arrived in Dusthaven 6 months before, and who had the earnest, slightly overwhelmed quality of someone still learning his territory, conducted the ceremony with genuine warmth. Sheriff Pettit, who was not a demonstrative man, shook Charles's hand afterward with both hands, which the assembled community understood to be the equivalent of a standing ovation from Harold Pettit. Gertrude wore white, a practical white dress. She had sewn herself with considerable assistance from Margaret Finch's opinion and occasional needle, and carried a bunch of early wildflowers that one of the Strickland children had gathered from the hillside the morning of the wedding, and presented to her with the pride of a significant contribution. She held them throughout the ceremony and felt the small damp roots and the earnest intention behind them, and it made her eyes sting in a way she was determined to manage. Charles looked at her through the entire ceremony with an expression that she filed away in the part of her mind, reserved for things she would want to remember with complete precision for the rest of her life. They went back to the ranch that evening, to the house that was now fully and undeniably hers, not in the extra room, but in the main bedroom, which had been made ready with attention, fresh linens, and a small bouquet on the dresser that Charles must have placed there at some point that day, because it was there when they arrived, and he didn't say anything about it, which was so perfectly him that she stood looking at the small arrangement of pine sprigs and late crocuses for a moment before she could speak. "You put flowers in the room," she said. "I thought it seemed appropriate," he said. She turned around and looked at him in the lamplight of their bedroom and thought about the extra room, the one he had built before he knew who needed it, and she thought about all the rooms a person builds in their life, the rooms made of habit and hope and stubborn, private faith, and she was, in that moment, simply and completely happy. Marriage to Charles Graves was as she had expected it to be in the ways she had been paying attention and surprising in the ways she had not anticipated. She had not anticipated, for instance, how comfortable silence was with him, how the shared quiet of a house with two people in it was entirely different in quality from the silence of solitude, warmer and more alive without being intrusive. She had not anticipated how naturally they negotiated the daily decisions of a shared life, each of them direct and non-dramatic about preferences and needs, the small contracts of cohabitation worked out with a collaborative competence that she found deeply satisfying. She continued teaching through the spring and into the summer, because the school board had arranged for the school to operate year-round with reduced hours in the summer months, given the agricultural demands on the families. She was building something real now at the school, a curriculum, a library, a culture in the schoolroom of intellectual curiosity and mutual respect that she could see taking hold in the children, becoming a habit of mind rather than just a set of lessons. Tobias Pine, the quiet boy from the homestead, had blossomed unexpectedly. He turned out to have a gift for mathematics that she had only suspected, until she gave him increasingly difficult problems and watched him solve them with an almost effortless intuition. She wrote a letter, with Charles's encouragement and assistance, to a teaching college in Denver about whether there might be scholarship provisions for a student of exceptional mathematical ability from a rural background. The letter was one of the most carefully argued pieces of writing she had ever composed. She was very proud of it. In June, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told Charles on a Thursday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the light coming through the west window and the smell of the day's warmth still in the room. She said it plainly, because that was how they talked, and watched his face. He was still for a long moment. Then he got up from his chair and came around to her side of the table and crouched down so he was at her eye level, which was a thing she hadn't seen him do before. And he put both hands over hers on the table, and his face had something on it that she had no precise word for. Joy was in it, certainly, and something more tender than that, and something that was almost fear. The fear of someone who has been given something they care about enormously and who is immediately aware of how much it would cost to lose it. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was Charles. The first question was always about her. "Very well," she said. "Entirely well." He held her hands for a moment longer. Then he said, "I should build another room." She laughed. She laughed the full, unguarded laugh that she had only recently found she could produce, the laugh that required the particular safety of being somewhere completely accepted, and he watched her laugh with the expression she had filed away from their wedding ceremony, added now with a new specific quality of brightness. "We have rooms," she said. "We might need more," he said with perfect seriousness. "One thing at a time," she said. He stood and pulled her gently to her feet and held her, just held her, in the kitchen in the June evening light, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed the familiar smell of him, wool and fresh air and something warm and particular to him, and thought about the room and the man who had built it and all the rooms that came after. The summer passed with a golden quality that she understood she would look back on for the rest of her life as a particular landmark of happiness. She was healthy, and the pregnancy was uncomplicated, which was something she gave thanks for with the specific intensity of a woman who knows it could easily have been otherwise. She taught through July and into August before she agreed to reduce her hours, not because Charles pressed her to, but because Lucia Mendoza, who was 11 now and had been quietly promoted to unofficial assistant teacher, was capable of handling the morning sessions with only light supervision. Lucia Mendoza's ascent to this unofficial role was one of the developments of the school year that gave Gertrude the most satisfaction. She had spent considerable effort over the past months with Lucia's parents, the Mendozas, who were hard-working, deeply family-oriented people who had not previously considered that their daughter might have a future beyond the farm. They were not resistant to the idea. They were simply startled by it, which required a different approach than resistance would have. She had spent an afternoon at the Mendoza farm talking about possibilities, and she had brought Charles, who said very little but whose presence as the most established rancher in the area communicated something that her words alone could not. The Mendozas agreed, eventually, to consider it. Lucia continued to arrive 15 minutes early and leave 15 minutes late. Charles built another room in August, which Gertrude discovered one morning when she came around the side of the house and found him there with Joseph Whitehorse and the Driscoll brothers, framing up an addition to the east side of the house. She stood and watched him for a moment, the clean economy of his movements, the particular competence of a man doing something he understood fully, and then she went and stood beside him and said, "One thing at a time," you said. "This is the next thing," he said without pausing. "There is," she observed, "not yet a next person to occupy it." "There will be," he said, with the calm certainty of a man who builds ahead of the need. She looked at the emerging frame of the room and thought about what he had said to her on her first evening, in the hallway, with the lantern in his hand. "I built this extra room before I knew who needed it." It was a thing that was true about him in a way that went beyond carpentry, this quality of building forward, of making space for what he believed would come rather than waiting for certainty before he began. It was the quality that had built the ranch, she thought. And it was the quality that had made room for her. "Joseph," she said to Joseph Whitehorse, who was measuring a board nearby, "did he have you help with my room as well, the first one?" Joseph measured carefully before he answered. "He had me help with the desk," he said, "the chair. He made the frame himself." She looked at Charles, who was apparently entirely occupied with the board he was inspecting. "He made it carefully," Joseph added, in the tone of a person finishing an answer that has more than one layer. "I know," she said. Their son was born on the 2nd of November, 1883, on a cold and clear Wednesday morning, with Margaret Finch present because Charles had gone for her at 4 in the morning, and she had come immediately, complaining loudly all the way to the ranch about the unreasonable hour, and then proceeding to be entirely indispensable for the next 6 hours. She was decisive and calm, and talked Gertrude through the worst of it with the frank, practical voice of a woman who had attended many births and knew exactly what was happening and what was needed, which was precisely the kind of support Gertrude required. Charles was in the hall. She was aware of him in the hall in the particular way she was aware of him in any nearby room, a warmth of presence, an orientation, the way a compass is aware of north. She heard him pacing and then stopping pacing and then pacing again, and once she heard him say something short and low to himself that she was not quite able to catch but whose emotional content was clear. When the baby came and cried his first loud, furious cry into the world, she heard the pacing stop entirely. Margaret Finch went out to the hall after a few minutes and came back without him, and then went back out, and then returned with Charles behind her, and his face had lost something of its usual composure in a way that made him look younger. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was red and indignant and wrapped in the flannel she had prepared, and then he looked at Gertrude, and he said nothing for a full minute, which was the most complete form of speechlessness she had ever observed in him. "He is healthy," she said, because she knew that was the question first. "Yes," Charles said, very quietly looking at the baby. "He is." He reached out one finger and the baby, with the random and powerful grip of a newborn, closed his fist around it. Charles looked at his finger in that tiny grip with an expression that she would have described as the face of a man who has just found something he didn't know he had lost but now cannot imagine having been without. "James," she said, "after your father." He looked at her. His face was she had no word for it. She stored it anyway in the part of her mind reserved for things she would want to remember with complete precision. "James," he said. "Yes." James Graves came into the world with an opinion, and communicated it frequently and vigorously for the first 3 months, which required the combined and sustained effort of his parents, in quantities that Gertrude had not entirely anticipated despite being practically minded about most things. Charles was present in the nights in a way that she had also not anticipated, and which touched her more than she was quite prepared for, rising without being asked, walking the length of the house in the dark, returning the baby when James was calm enough to sleep again. He did not present this as a sacrifice or a contribution requiring acknowledgement. He simply did it, the way he did most things, because it was what was needed. By spring, James had decided that the world was, on balance, interesting enough to observe with some optimism rather than register as offense, and his personality began to emerge with a clarity that made both his parents laugh. He had Charles's directness of gaze and Gertrude's interest in everything, a combination that produced a baby who looked at every new object and person with an intense and flattering scrutiny that most people found charming. Gertrude returned to teaching in March, with adjustments. Margaret Finch had volunteered to be with James in the mornings, an arrangement so efficiently proposed and so clearly in Margaret's interest that Gertrude accepted it with gratitude and no guilt whatsoever. Lucia Mendoza had formally become Gertrude's student teacher, the first step in the plan for her future education that Gertrude had been building carefully for over a year. The letter to the Denver Teaching College had received a positive response in the fall, and a further exchange of letters through the winter had established that there were provisions for qualified rural students of exceptional ability, and that Lucia Mendoza, based on Gertrude's recommendation, and a written examination that Gertrude had administered and sent in with the correspondence, qualified. Lucia would be able to begin at the college in September of 1885, when she was 14, old enough just for the junior program with financial provisions from the college, and a small supplemental fund that Gertrude had raised through what she described to Charles as a community education initiative, and which was in fact her own salary supplemented by a contribution from Charles that she discovered later and was not surprised by. She told Lucia in April, on a Thursday after school, with the spring coming in through the windows and James asleep in a basket in the corner, where Lucia had rocked him to sleep with the smooth competence of an eldest child of a large family. She told her what the college had said and what was possible and watched Lucia's face do something remarkable, go very still and then very bright, in the way of someone receiving news that they had hoped for without quite allowing themselves to believe in it. "This is real," Lucia said. "Entirely real," Gertrude said. Lucia looked at James asleep in the basket, then at Gertrude, then at the window and the April light. "My mother is going to cry," she said, not as a complaint but as an observation. "Probably," Gertrude agreed. "I expect I will too," she did. At the Mendoza farm the following Sunday, sitting at the table with the whole family gathered in the way the Mendozas gathered for anything important, while Maria Mendoza cried quietly into her apron and Lucia's father, Eduardo, sat very upright with the expression of a man who is feeling something enormous and has not yet worked out the shape of it. Gertrude sat with them and let it land and then answered every question they had about the college with the steady, prepared honesty she had brought to her first letter. And by the end of the afternoon, Eduardo Mendoza had shaken her hand with both hands and said something in Spanish that she didn't know the words of but understood entirely. Riding back to the ranch in the late afternoon with Charles, James in her arms and the sky going orange over the mountains, she told him what had happened, the whole of it. He listened with his full attention as he always did. "You are very good at this," he said when she was finished. "At what?" "Seeing what people need and building toward it," he said, "even when they don't know what they need yet." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of that observation settle into her. Then she said, "I learned from someone." He looked at her sideways, and she looked back, and the evening light made everything gold, and the horse moved steadily toward home and James made a small, contented sound against her shoulder. The summer of 1884 brought both good fortune and the kind of challenge that tests what a life is actually built from. The cattle market was strong, which meant the Graves Creek Ranch had the most prosperous year in its history, a fact Charles registered with characteristic understatement by noting that the books were looking better than expected, and then quietly proceeding to invest in improvements he had been planning for years. A new well, better fencing on the south pasture, an extension of the barn that Joseph Whitehorse designed with an elegance that Gertrude noted was the sign of someone who could have been an architect in different circumstances. The challenge came in August, from the direction she had least anticipated, which was the direction from which challenges tended to come. A letter arrived from Cincinnati addressed to Charles Graves. She was not present when he read it, having been at the schoolhouse, but when she came home that afternoon she found him at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him, and an expression she recognized as the one he had when working through a problem he was uncertain about. She sat down across from him and waited. The letter was from a lawyer in Cincinnati representing the estate of Arthur Callum. Arthur Callum, it transpired, had died in January. Not violently, not dramatically, but of pneumonia, the way a great many men died in Ohio winters, and his estate was in the process of being settled. The letter was formal and somewhat convoluted in its legal language, but its import was clear. There was, apparently, some question in the settling of the estate about whether certain correspondences and circumstances relating to Gertrude Rhodes constituted a claim or counterclaim of some kind. The lawyer was inquiring whether she wished to make a statement. She read it twice. She felt Charles watching her read it. "He's gone," she said when she finished. "Yes," Charles said. She sat with that for a moment. Arthur Callum had been a fact of her past for so long, a specific shape of betrayal and shame that had pressed against her life for the 2 years since she had left Cincinnati, and now he was simply gone. She found that she felt very little about it, not relief exactly and certainly not grief, but a kind of quiet finalization, the way a door that has been slightly ajar for years finally clicks shut. "The legal matter is nothing," Charles said. "There is no valid claim against you or against anything you are part of. Our lawyer in Pueblo can confirm it and respond accordingly, but I wanted you to know about the letter before I took any action." "Yes," she said, "thank you. Are you all right?" he asked in the tone that still, after a year and a half of marriage, had the power to reach past whatever composed face she was wearing and land directly on the truth. "I am," she said, and then, more honestly, "I find that I am more all right than I expected to be, given what this is. Is that terrible?" "No," he said. "I think that's complete. It's the end of something." "The beginning was the end of something," she said. "This is just the closing of a chapter that had already been finished." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat at the kitchen table while James played on the floor nearby with a set of wooden blocks that Joseph Whitehorse had carved him, and the ordinary warmth of the afternoon went on around them. Charles wrote to the Pueblo lawyer. The matter was resolved by September, with a brevity that confirmed it had never been a serious legal issue. The Callum estate lawyer had apparently been conducting a somewhat scattershot inquiry into various correspondences, and the response from Gertrude's representative had been sufficient to conclude it. She received a formal letter of resolution in October and put it in the small tin box where she kept important documents and thought about it no further. The autumn of 1884 brought a development that she had suspected since July, but confirmed with Margaret Finch's practical assessment in September. She was expecting again. She told Charles in the kitchen, same as the first time, same table, same evening light through the west window. His face did the same thing it had done the first time, the stilling, the brightness, the care with an additional quality of practiced certainty, the look of a man who has been through this once and knows what he is in for and is entirely prepared to be in for it again. "Shall I start on the new room?" he said. "The room is already built," she said. "You built it in August." He looked faintly satisfied in a way that she found extraordinarily endearing. The second child was a daughter, born in April of 1885 on a morning that was warm enough to have the windows open, which meant the spring sounds came in, while Margaret Finch presided over the proceedings with her usual decisive competence. She was small and had an immediately discernible personality, calm and focused, and given to long observations of whatever was in front of her, the look of someone who is taking in a great deal of information before deciding what to do with it. They named her Clara Rhodes Graves, taking Gertrude's surname as her middle name, which had been her idea and which Charles had agreed to without hesitation. James, who was 18 months old and navigating the world with the ambitious, wobbly confidence of a child, who has recently discovered walking and has strong opinions about where to direct it, accepted his sister with a mixture of interest and mild suspicion that eventually, over the following weeks, resolved into a possessive affection that made him bring her objects for examination with the generosity of a host showing a guest the important things. Lucia Mendoza left for the Denver Teaching College in September of 1885 as planned. Gertrude saw her off at the stage with Maria and Eduardo and the younger Mendoza children, and she pressed into Lucia's hands a letter she had written to the college's principal detailing Lucia's particular abilities and the specific ways they should be challenged, and a small gift, a good pen, the kind that was designed for long use, with the implicit message in the gift itself that she expected the pen to be thoroughly used. Lucia held the pen and looked at Gertrude with the dark, serious eyes that had been looking at Gertrude from the front row of the schoolhouse for 3 years, and she said, "I am going to come back." "I know you are," Gertrude said. "I am counting on it." She did come back, 2 years later, as a fully trained teacher, and took over the Dusthaven school in a handover that Gertrude orchestrated with the care of something she had been planning since the first time she saw Lucia arrive early and stay late. By 1887, Gertrude was working part-time at the school, consulting with Lucia on curriculum and methods, while managing the increasingly complex social and educational fabric she had built around the school, the community library she had established in a room at the general store, the adult literacy classes she had been running on Wednesday evenings for 2 years, the ongoing campaign for a proper school building to replace the renovated grain storage. The proper school building was built in 1888. It was a good building, 2 rooms with proper windows and a stove and a real cloakroom for the children's coats. The school board, of which Charles was still a member, voted the funds unanimously. The building was constructed by Joseph Whitehorse and the Driscoll brothers, with considerable community labor contributed by the families of the area, and the dedication ceremony on a Saturday in October was attended by what appeared to be most of the population of Dusthaven and the surrounding homesteads. Gertrude spoke at the dedication, which was not something she had planned to do until the moment arose, and it seemed like the right thing. She spoke about what education was for, which she said was not the filling of children with facts, but the building in them of the capacity to think, to question, to understand that their own minds were instruments of considerable power, and that learning to use those instruments was the most important work they would do. She said that the town of Dusthaven had committed to something remarkable in building this school, not because a building was remarkable, but because the commitment behind it was the belief that every child in the valley deserved the full and sustained attention of a community that cared about their future. She said a few other things. At the end, she said that she owed the people of Dusthaven a debt she could not fully repay, because they had given her the chance to be, in their community, exactly who she wanted to be. She did not say anything more specific than that, because what she meant was large and personal and required translation to be said in public. But she looked at Charles while she said it, and he looked back at her, and the translation was complete. James was 5 by the building's dedication. He attended the new school on its first day with the proprietary enthusiasm of a child whose mother had been planning it for years. He was smart and restless and gregarious, and had a gift, already visible at 5, for charming people, teachers and classmates both, which he deployed with what Gertrude hoped was not too much awareness of its effect. She mentioned this to Charles, who said that it was fair given the genes available, and that she should teach the boy to use it well rather than suppress it, which was such a good piece of advice that she was briefly annoyed she hadn't thought of it first. Clara at 3 was different from her brother in the ways that complemented him. Where he was loud, she was precise. Where he was immediate, she was patient. She had begun reading at 2.5 in the way of children who absorb things from their environment, without being formally taught, because their environment is a teacher's house, and the environment makes it somewhat inevitable. She was also already the family diplomat, inserting herself between James's enthusiasms and their consequences with a gravity that was remarkably effective coming from someone who had recently mastered stairs. They were, Gertrude thought one evening in the winter of 1888, sitting by the fire with Charles's arm around her shoulders and James, asleep upstairs and Clara in her lap with a picture book, examining each page with the focused attention that was already her signature characteristic. They were exactly what she had not known she was building toward when she had stepped off the stage in Dusthaven in the autumn of 1882. She had thought she was escaping. She had thought she was finding work. She had thought she was becoming someone new. She had done all of those things. She had also, without knowing it was possible, been walking toward this fire, these children, this man, this life. She thought about the extra room. She thought about him standing in the hallway with the lantern, saying it quietly, almost to himself, "I built this extra room before I knew who needed it." She thought about what she had understood in that moment and what she had been afraid to believe. "What are you thinking about?" Charles asked. He had the particular tone of someone who asks not to make conversation but because he genuinely wants to know. "The room," she said. "The first one. The one you built before I arrived." He was quiet for a moment. Clara turned a page. "What about it?" he said. "I think about it often," she said. "I think about what you said and what I understood when you said it and how unlikely it seems now that I didn't trust it sooner." He pulled her slightly closer, adjusting his arm around her. "You trusted it," he said. "You walked in." "I did," she said. "That's true." "That was enough," he said. "That's all it needed to be." The fire settled. Clara discovered something of interest on her page and showed it to Gertrude with a pointed finger and an expressive sound of satisfaction. Gertrude looked at it and agreed that it was very interesting. Charles looked at it too, bending his head toward theirs in the lamplight. Outside, the Colorado winter was conducting itself with its usual authority, and the house held its warmth, and the creek that ran along the north boundary moved under the ice with the quiet certainty of water that knows where it is going even in the cold, and Dusthaven slept its small-town sleep with all its ordinary human complexity, its kindnesses and its shortcomings, its families and its histories, its stories being built and its rooms being filled, and inside the ranch house that Charles Graves's father had homesteaded in 1869, in a life that had grown into every room that had been built for it, and a few rooms that hadn't been planned at all, but turned out to be necessary. Gertrude Rhodes Graves sat by the fire with the people who were her entire world and felt, simply and completely and without reservation, at home. The spring of 1889 brought the kind of change that comes when a place has been flourishing long enough to draw attention to itself. A railroad survey team came through the valley in March, looking at the terrain for a potential branch line that would connect Dusthaven to the main Denver line. The news landed in the town with the electric quality of something that could change everything, and the community's response was a mixture of excitement and anxiety in proportions that varied by how established any given household was. The more established were more cautious. The newer homesteads, still building toward solvency, were more enthusiastic. Charles attended the community meeting about the railroad with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and said relatively little, until most of the positions in the room had been expressed. And then he said, with the quiet authority of a man who has lived in a place long enough to understand its bones, that the railroad would come whether the community wanted it or not if the survey determined it was viable, and that the more productive question was not whether but how. Meaning what terms the community should seek, and what protections should be in place for the land and water rights that were the foundation of every operation in the valley. This observation focused the meeting considerably. He was appointed to the committee that would negotiate with the railroad company, alongside Eduardo Mendoza, who had become one of the more respected voices in the farming community, and Margaret Finch, who needed no appointment because she was going to be involved regardless and everyone knew it. Gertrude followed the negotiations with interest and provided, when Charles wanted to think through the arguments, the particular kind of engaged skeptical attention that helped him sharpen his own positions. She was good at this, at asking the question that revealed the weak point in an argument before an adversary could find it, which Charles called useful, and which she called basic logical hygiene. The negotiations took 3 months and resulted in terms that protected the water rights of the surrounding farms and set the route of the line along the eastern edge of the valley where it would cause minimum disruption to the established operations. The railroad came through in 1890. Dusthaven grew. A second general store opened. The hotel was renovated and expanded. 2 new families arrived to establish homesteads on previously unoccupied land to the north. A doctor named Henry Marsh came and opened a practice in a building on the main street, which Gertrude considered one of the most significant improvements in the community's quality of life since the school. She met Dr. Marsh's wife, a forthright and intelligent woman named Abigail, within a week of their arrival, and they became friends with the quickly established certainty of 2 women who recognize in each other the same fundamental seriousness about the things that matter. Abigail had strong opinions about public health and sanitation that were considerably ahead of most of the town's assumptions, and Gertrude introduced them into the school curriculum, with Lucia's enthusiastic cooperation and Margaret Finch's powerful endorsement. James started the new school year at 7 with an attitude toward learning that was exactly what she had always hoped to encourage in her students, and which was slightly more challenging to manage when it was your own child. A passionate curiosity paired with an absolute certainty that his current question was the most important question currently being asked, which sometimes was true and required genuine engagement, and sometimes was a negotiation. Clara, at 5, began formal schooling with Lucia Mendoza's class, where she was immediately identified by Lucia in a note to Gertrude that said, "She will either be a scholar or a lawyer. I am not sure these are different things." Gertrude shared this assessment with Charles over supper, and he looked at Clara across the table eating her vegetables with systematic thoroughness and said, "Both," as if it were settled, which Clara appeared to find reasonable. By 1891, Gertrude was 45 years old in her perception of time and 35 years old in calendar years, in the sense that she had lived more in the decade since arriving in Dusthaven than in the 2 decades before it. She was the foundation on which the town's educational system was built. She was the person the Mendozas called when Eduardo had a legal question, not because she was a lawyer, but because she was the person most likely to know who could help. She was the person Margaret Finch consulted when Margaret was trying to determine whether a thing was actually the right thing to do versus simply the thing Margaret wanted to do, which Gertrude had discovered was a real and genuine distinction for Margaret underneath the brisk certainty of her manner. She was also, in the daily private specificity of her actual life, Charles Graves's wife, which remained the most interesting and sustaining aspect of her existence in a way that she had not entirely expected. Not because she had not believed in their love, but because she had not expected it to deepen the way it had. She had expected marriage to settle into a warm and reliable comfort, which it had. She had not expected it to also keep surprising her, to keep having moments of recognition that sent something like electricity through an ordinary afternoon. He surprised her in March of 1891 with a trip to Denver, arranged around a cattle business trip he was making, extended by 3 days for no cattle-related purpose. They left James and Clara with the Mendoza family, who received them with the cheerful efficiency of a family that genuinely liked children and had plenty of experience managing extra ones. They took the train from Dusthaven Station, which still gave Gertrude a small sensation of the surreal, the train that had come through because of negotiations in which Charles had participated, running through the valley that had been Charles's family's land. Denver in 1891 was not the city she had known in Cincinnati, but it was a city with a complexity and scale that she had not experienced in 9 years of Dusthaven. She felt it like a kind of recalibration, a reminder of a larger world that she had not lost but had set somewhat to the side. They attended a concert at the Opera House, a visiting orchestra from the East performing works that she had not heard performed live since Cincinnati, and she sat beside Charles in the dim hall with his hand covering hers in his lap, and let the music do what music does, which is reach past the reasonable defenses a person builds around their most tender perceptions, and she felt things she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Or perhaps had felt so gradually that she hadn't recognized them accumulating. On the last evening in Denver, at dinner in the hotel dining room, she told him some of this. Not all of it, there was too much, and the dining room was public, but enough that he understood what she was saying, which was that she was happy in a way that she had sometimes been afraid to fully acknowledge because she had been so afraid of having it taken away. He listened, as he always listened, with his full attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have felt that too, the caution, the sense that it should not be this good, that something will find a way to undo it." And she asked, "And I have decided," he said, "that it is this good, that it will continue to be this good, that the appropriate response is not caution but gratitude. She looked at him across the table, this man who had built a room before he knew who needed it, who had been waiting with a kind of faithful patience she had not known people were capable of until she had seen it in him, who had looked at her on the first day and seen her rather than the position she was filling, and she felt the love she had for him as something large and specific and permanent, a thing as structural as the timbers of the house they had built a life in. "I agree," she said. He raised his glass, which contained an exceptionally good wine that he had ordered by consulting with the waiter with his characteristic thoroughness. "To gratitude," he said. "To gratitude," she agreed. They returned to Dusthaven to find James and Clara in excellent health and higher spirits than they had been in when they left, which said something complimentary about the Mendozas, and something that would need to be gently managed about the effect of 3 days with 8 cousins on the children's expectations about appropriate noise levels. Life in Dusthaven continued to build itself in the ways that communities build when they have enough of the right things. The school expanding. A second classroom opened in 1892 to accommodate the growing population, with Lucia Mendoza as its principal and 2 additional teachers she had helped to recruit. The adult literacy classes formalized into a proper community learning program that met 3 times a week and had a waiting list. The library in the back of Margaret Finch's store became an actual library in an actual building in 1893, funded by a combination of community subscription and a contribution from the school board, with Margaret Finch as its presiding presence and self-appointed acquisition committee. There were sorrows, too, as there are in any decade of a life. Margaret Finch's husband, a quiet man named Robert who had run the store alongside Margaret for 30 years, died of a heart attack in the summer of 1892. The community gathered around Margaret with the instinctive loyalty of a small town for one of its own, and she was, after a period of grief that she conducted with the same direct thoroughness she brought to everything else, unchanged and unchanged. Still the same Margaret, still indispensable, still right about most things, but with a new quality in her eyes when she thought no one was observing, which was the quality of someone living in a world that has a permanent absence in it. Gertrude sat with her on many evenings that winter, just sat, because Margaret did not always want to talk but did not want to be alone, and the particular use of presence without performance was something Gertrude understood from her own dark period and could offer now without effort. Joseph Whitehorse and his family moved north in 1893 to be closer to relatives of his wife's family, a decision that was practical and right, but which left a gap at the Graves Creek Ranch that was not quite fillable. Charles said goodbye to him on a morning in April that was very clear and very cold for April, and she stood on the porch and watched the 2 men talk with the ease of people who have been working alongside each other for a long time and know how to say important things in practical language. They shook hands. Joseph nodded at Gertrude. She nodded back. After he was gone and the buckboard carrying his family and their belongings had disappeared around the curve of the road, Charles stood on the porch for a moment without speaking. "He helped me build the room," he said. "Your room, the first one." "I know," she said. "He told me." He was quiet another moment. "Then he told me once years before you came that a house with only one person in it is just a building, that what makes it a house is the people choosing to be in it." She stood beside him on the porch in the April cold and took his hand and held it, and the landscape opened out before them, the valley, the mountains, the creek that ran along the north boundary, the land that his father had homesteaded with $20 and a plan. "He was right," she said. "Yes," Charles said. He was. James at 9 was everything he had been at 5, with 10 added degrees of intensity. He had a gift for numbers that rivaled Tobias Pines, who had by this point gone to the State University in Boulder on a scholarship, and was studying engineering news that had arrived in a letter to Gertrude that she had read aloud to Charles at the kitchen table, with a satisfaction that was entirely, shamelessly personal. James also had an interest in animals that expressed itself in a steady parade of recovered and rehabilitated wildlife that came through the ranch: injured birds, a fox kit, a rabbit with a damaged leg, each of which he nursed with the methodical care of someone who takes responsibility seriously once he has taken it on. Clara at 7 was reading at a level that required Lucia Mendoza to build a separate reading list for her, and to use words like exceptional in conversations with Gertrude that were technically professional assessments, but had the warmth of something personal, because Lucia knew exactly what Gertrude had invested in the school and what it meant to see it coming back through the next generation. Clara was also developing the social exactness that would turn out to be one of her lifelong characteristics, a precise and unsparing sense of whether a thing was fair that she applied with equal rigor to her own situation and others. And that made her both a reliable reporter and an occasionally inconvenient presence when adults were trying to manage a situation without full transparency. In 1894, Gertrude found herself pregnant for the third time. She was 37 years old, which was not young for a pregnancy, and she was aware of this in the way a person who reads and pays attention to medical developments is aware of it. Dr. Marsh was aware of it too, and managed the situation with the combination of honest information and genuine reassurance that made him the kind of doctor who was trusted rather than merely consulted. She told Charles in the evening, not at the kitchen table this time but on the porch, in the warm September air, with the mountains going purple in the distance and the cattle somewhere in the south pasture, and the sound of James and Clara conducting some sort of negotiation inside the house that had the particular cadence of a debate that would resolve itself. He took the news with the quiet, warm attention he had brought to it before, but also with a kind of stillness that told her he understood the dimensions of this time being different. "We will be careful," he said. "We will be practical," she said, because careful was a word that implied fear of the thing and she didn't want to be afraid of it. "Both," he said. The pregnancy was uncomplicated. Dr. Marsh was thorough, and Margaret Finch, who had not lost any of her competence in the 12 years since James's birth, was present and indispensable when the time came in April of 1895, in a spring that arrived with more warmth and cooperation than spring usually managed in Colorado. The third child was a son. He was born on a Tuesday morning in a room full of April light, and he announced himself with the decisive clarity of a person who intends to make his presence known. They named him Henry Joseph Graves, Henry for Dr. Marsh and Joseph for Joseph Whitehorse, which Charles had decided without discussion, and which Gertrude agreed to with the completeness of someone who sees immediately that a decision is right. Henry Joseph Graves came into the world looking profoundly interested in it, which his parents recognized as a family trait. James, at 12, received the news of a brother with the satisfaction of someone who had privately wanted one over the alternative. Clara, at 10, received the baby with the contained and precise tenderness of someone who had been preparing a comprehensive developmental plan. Henry received their attention with the equanimity of a third child who has been born into a full house and finds it perfectly acceptable. The ranch, the school, the town, the family, all of it moved into the second half of the 1890s with the purposeful momentum of things that have been well built and properly maintained. Charles hired a second ranch manager in 1896, a capable young man from a ranching family in Wyoming named Paul Sutter, who took on the daily operational management in a way that allowed Charles to work slightly differently, still present, still entirely engaged, but with the particular freedom of a man who has built something solid enough to share the carrying of it. He used some of this freedom, quietly and without announcement, to do things with Gertrude that the operational intensity of the earlier years had not always allowed. They rode together on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, out along the creek and up into the foothills, In the same companionable silence they had developed in their first autumn together, but richer now, layered with a decade and more of shared life. They took James to Denver for 3 days in 1897 when he was 14, to see the city and to visit the university campus in Boulder, and watched him encounter both with the particular electric attention of a young person beginning to understand the scale of what's possible. The visit to the university was Gertrude's idea and Charles's logistical execution, which was their characteristic division. James walked across the campus with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving over everything, and he said very little, which in a boy who usually said a great deal was its own significant communication. "Engineering," he said, on the train back to Dusthaven, with the simplicity of a person who has just understood something about themselves. "Like Tobias Pine," Gertrude said. James considered this. "I heard about Tobias Pine my whole life," he said, in the tone of a child who has been strategically educated. "You meant for me to hear about him." She looked at him with the composed expression she had deployed for years in the classroom. "I meant for you to understand what was possible," she said. He considered this and decided to accept it, which was its own kind of growing up. By 1899, as the century approached its close, Dusthaven was not the small and isolated outpost it had been when Gertrude had stepped off the stage there in 1882. It was a proper town. It had a doctor, a school with 3 classrooms, a library, a church that had been reinforced so the steeple no longer leaned, 2 general stores, a hotel, a proper bank, a post office, and a civic life that expressed itself through school board meetings and harvest festivals, and the annual gathering that had once been the Abbot's Christmas party, and had gradually expanded to include most of the community in a celebration that now required the school building to contain it. The Abbotts were still there. The Stricklands were still there, their 5 children now mostly grown and several of them with children of their own, which produced a generational continuity that was one of the things Gertrude found most satisfying about staying in a place. The Mendozas were there. Lucia Mendoza was running the school with a distinction that was beginning to be recognized beyond Dusthaven. She had corresponded with the state education office about curriculum standards and had been invited to present at an educational conference in Denver. Gertrude attended the conference with her. They took the train on a Thursday morning and presented together on Friday afternoon, Lucia leading and Gertrude adding the historical context of how the Dusthaven school had been built and what had worked and why. The audience was mostly male, mostly from larger and more established school systems, and their attention was initially polite and became increasingly genuine as the session went on, because the results Gertrude and Lucia described were not easily dismissible, and the methods behind them were rigorously documented. Afterward, in the hotel lobby, Lucia said, "You built this. All of this. 17 years ago you came off the stage and started building it." "You continued it," Gertrude said. "That's what building means. You make something that others can take further." Lucia looked at her with the dark, serious eyes that had been looking at her since the schoolhouse, unchanged in their quality, though the face around them had grown into the face of a capable adult woman of 28. "You should know that I intend to build further still," she said. "I know," Gertrude said. "I'm counting on it." She returned to the ranch on Saturday and Charles met her at the station and she stepped down onto the platform and he held out his hand and she took it and he said, "How did it go?" "Very well," she said. "Lucia was extraordinary." "And you?" he said. "I was the person who knew why Lucia was extraordinary," she said, "which is its own kind of role." He smiled at her, the full, unguarded one, and she smiled back. At home that evening, Henry at 4 was asleep and James was doing something with technical drawings at the kitchen table, and Clara was reading at the window in the last of the October light. And Charles made tea without being asked, and set a cup in front of her and sat across the table. And she held the cup with both hands and looked around the kitchen at the family she had built in the house that had been built for her. The century turned in the way that centuries turn. not with a great noise, but with the quiet continuation of ordinary days that happened to cross a particular line on a calendar. January of 1900 arrived in Dusthaven with snow, and the reliable sounds of a working ranch and children who were fascinated by the zeros, and a town that had survived its first 20 years of incorporation and was building its second. James enrolled at the University of Colorado in Boulder in the fall of 1900 at 17, which required a negotiation with the university that drew on everything Gertrude had learned about making a clear, documented case for exceptional circumstances, since 17 was young by the university's preference. The case was made. It succeeded. James departed in September with a trunk that was significantly less battered than her first one had been, and with the focused expression of someone moving purposefully towards something they have wanted for a long time. The house was quieter without him, and it was a specific kind of quiet, the kind that contains both loss and pride in proportions that shift depending on the moment. She sat in the kitchen on the first morning after he left and was aware of the particular depth of what had been built in this house, of what she had been given and what she had contributed, and she thought again, inevitably, about the room. The extra room, built before he knew who needed it. Henry was in that room now. It had been his room since he was born, the natural progression of a family that had grown into the space that was waiting for it. She sometimes stood in the hallway, not often but sometimes, and remembered the first evening, the lantern light, the words Charles had said without entirely meaning to say them. She was 37 in 1900. She was made of this place, made of the children and the school and the mountains and the creek and the years of driving and teaching and laughing and sitting by the fire, made of mornings that smelled of coffee and evenings that smelled of wood smoke, made of the particular and irreplaceable texture of sharing a life with someone who was paying full attention. She found Charles one evening in late October, working in the barn in the lamplight on a piece of harness that needed repair, and she stood in the barn doorway and watched him work with the same feeling she had had 17 years ago watching him build the addition to the east side of the house, the clean economy of his movements, the specific competence of a man who understands exactly what he's doing. He looked up. "I was thinking," she said, "about what your father told you. The most important thing you can build is something worth staying in." He waited, knowing she was not finished. "I think he was right," she said, "and I think you built it, all of this." She made a gesture that was inadequate to what she meant but was, she thought, understood anyway. He set down the harness and stood up and came to where she was standing in the doorway, and he stood close to her, and the barn was warm from the animals and the lamp, and outside the October night was clear and very cold and very full of stars. "We built it," he said. "We built it," she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood together in the lamplight at the edge of the warm barn looking out at the cold, clear night. And the Graves Creek Ranch held its life around them. The cattle in the south pasture and Henry sleeping in the house and Clara in her room with her books, and the creek running cold and certain along the north boundary. And it was real, all of it, absolutely and permanently and joyfully real. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, just as she had in the kitchen on the evening they had found out about James, and breathed the familiar smell of him. 17 years of familiar. The best kind of familiar, the kind that deepens rather than diminishes, the kind you discover more of the longer you stay inside it. "We should go in," he said. "It's cold." "It is," she agreed without moving. He held her a moment longer. Then they went in together, out of the dark and the cold and into the warmth of the house, where everything they had built was waiting for them. The years that followed moved with the particular quality of a life that knows what it is, not without difficulty, not without change, but with the deep underlying current of rightness that comes from choosing well and building carefully and staying, with full intention, in something worth staying in. Clara grew into exactly the scholar and advocate that Lucia Mendoza had predicted, eventually going to Denver to study law. a thing that required considerable correspondence with educational institutions that had not previously considered women as students, but found, eventually, that Gertrude Rhodes Graves's letters were difficult to argue with. James graduated from the University of Colorado with a degree in civil engineering and began building the bridges and roads and infrastructure of a state that was still, in many of its corners, being built. Henry, at 10 and 11 and 12, was discovering that he was most himself outdoors, most alive in the moving world of the ranch, and was already, at 13, the best rider among the Graves children, a title James had never competed for and Clara had not sought, and which Henry wore with the unpretentious pride of someone who has found the thing that fits. There was a morning in the spring of 1905, a Tuesday, unremarkable in most respects, clear and not yet warm, when Gertrude woke early, before Charles, before Henry, before the ranch sounds had fully begun. She lay in the quiet and listened to the house breathing around her, the particular sound of a lived-in place, and she thought about all the mornings that had preceded this one, and how they had built to it the way creeks build to rivers. She thought about a young woman with a battered trunk stepping off a stage in a small Colorado town in the autumn of 1882, with a secret and a sorrow and a stubborn, frightened hope that she could make herself into someone she was proud of in a place where no one had a prior claim on the story of who she was. She thought about a man with brown eyes and a bay horse, and a way of looking at her that saw her rather than the position she was filling. She thought about a room with a window facing east, built with care, waiting. She got up quietly and went to the kitchen and made coffee the way it had always been made in this house, strong enough to stand a spoon in. And she stood at the east window with her cup and watched the light come in from the mountains, the same light that had been coming in every morning for 23 years, unchanged and always somehow new. Charles found her there, as he often did, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his boots in his hand and his hair not yet entirely organized, and he stopped when he saw her at the window, and she turned, and they looked at each other with the accumulated knowledge of two people who have seen each other every morning for 23 years and have not yet run out of things to find there. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He came into the kitchen, and she poured him coffee, and he stood beside her at the window, and they looked out at the morning together, at the mountains and the sky and the creek that ran along the north boundary of the ranch his father had built, in the place where they had built something that had grown beyond either of them into a life that included children and students and friends and a town and 23 years of mornings. "I built this extra room before I knew who needed it," he had said 23 years ago in a hallway with a lantern, and she had understood everything. She still did. She understood it more now, more completely, more specifically, more gratefully, than she had on that first evening. She understood that it was not just the room. It was the whole of it, the whole life he had been building, the whole space he had been making, the careful and faithful preparation of someone who believed that the right things would come to fill the rooms he had made ready if he built them well enough and waited long enough and kept the door open. She had walked through that door. She had filled that room. She had brought herself, her whole complicated true self, her sorrows and her strengths and her hidden past and her capacity for love, and he had received all of it with the steady, undiminished attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly her, though neither of them had known it yet. She put her hand over his on the windowsill, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the coffee was warm and the morning was coming in golden and certain over the mountains, and the life they had built together held them both, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.